It was my own daughter-in-law sitting in my kitchen wearing my robe. Meanwhile, my husband said, "Accept the divorce settlement, or leave with nothing." I just smiled and said I'd be leaving tomorrow. But what they had no idea was that the cars, the mansion, and all the luxuries were just my little hobby. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I would see my own daughter-in-law sitting in my kitchen wearing my silk robe, but there she was. Thalia looked perfectly at home, her long auburn hair cascading over the emerald green fabric that I had received as an anniversary gift just 2 years ago. She was sipping coffee from my favorite china cup, the one with delicate roses that had belonged to my grandmother. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the marble countertops that I had personally selected during our kitchen renovation 5 years earlier. Everything in this house bore my touch, my careful choices, my memories. Yet Thalia sat there as if she owned every inch of it. "Good morning, Clarice," she said without looking up from her phone, her voice carrying that particular tone of dismissal I had grown accustomed to over the past year. She scrolled through her social media with painted nails, completely unbothered by my presence in what was supposed to be my own home. I stood frozen in the doorway, still in my nightgown, my graying hair in curlers. At 61, I had never felt more invisible than I did in that moment. The woman who had married my son 3 years ago was now treating me like an unwelcome guest in my own space. "Where's Quinn?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. Thalia's lips curved into what might have been a smile if it had reached her eyes. "He's in the study. He's been waiting for you." She paused, finally looking at me directly. "We both have." Something cold settled in my stomach as I made my way down the familiar hallway. The walls were lined with family photographs spanning 30 years of marriage, but they felt like someone else's memories now. Each picture seemed to mock me as I passed, reminding me of happier times when I believed in the life I thought I had built. I found Quinn exactly where Thalia said he would be, sitting behind the mahogany desk that had been his father's. He didn't look up when I entered, continuing to shuffle through papers with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, calculated. Nothing like the man I had fallen in love with 3 decades ago. "Sit down, Clarice," he said, still not meeting my eyes. I remained standing, something stubborn rising in my chest despite the fear. "What's this about, Quinn?" He finally looked up, and what I saw there nearly knocked the breath from my lungs. There was no warmth, no recognition of our shared history, no acknowledgement of the woman who had stood by his side through business failures, family deaths, and countless challenges. I was looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. "This marriage is over," he said matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing the weather. "I've had papers drawn up. You can sign them and take a reasonable settlement, or you can fight this and leave with nothing." The words hit me like physical blows. 30 years. 30 years of cooking his meals, managing his household, entertaining his clients, supporting his dreams. 30 years of being Mrs. Quinn Morrison, the devoted wife who made everything possible for him to succeed. "I don't understand," I whispered, sinking into the leather chair across from his desk. "What reasonable settlement?" Quinn's expression didn't change. $50,000 and your personal belongings. That's more than generous considering you never contributed financially to this household. Never contributed financially. The phrase echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. If only he knew the truth about where his comfortable lifestyle had really come from. If only he understood what I had quietly built while he slept peacefully beside me night after night. "And if I don't sign?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Then you leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing." He leaned back in his chair, completely confident in his position. "The house, the cars, the bank accounts, the investments, everything is in my name, Clarice. You have no legal claim to any of it." At that moment, Thalia appeared in the doorway, now wearing one of my favorite dresses. The audacity of it should have made me angry, but instead, I felt something else entirely, a strange calm that I hadn't experienced in years. "Quinn's being very generous," she said, moving to stand behind his chair with her hand on his shoulder. Most men wouldn't offer anything to a wife who never worked. I studied them both carefully. They looked so confident, so certain of their victory. They had no idea what they were dealing with. They saw exactly what I had allowed them to see for 3 decades. A quiet, submissive housewife who had never had an opinion that mattered or a thought beyond the next dinner party. "When do you want me to leave?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. Quinn blinked, clearly expecting more of a fight. "Tomorrow morning. That gives you time to pack your things." I stood slowly, smoothing down my nightgown with hands that weren't shaking despite everything. "That sounds reasonable." Both of them stared at me in obvious confusion. Thalia's grip on Quinn's shoulder tightened slightly. "You're not going to fight this?" Quinn asked, suspicion creeping into his voice. I smiled then, a real smile that felt foreign on my face after so many years of carefully controlled expressions. "No, Quinn, I'm not going to fight you." The relief in the room was palpable, but there was something else too. Uncertainty. They had expected tears, begging, perhaps even threats. My calm acceptance clearly unsettled them more than any dramatic scene would have. "I'll start packing this afternoon," I continued, moving toward the door. "There are just a few phone calls I need to make first." As I walked back down the hallway, I could hear them whispering behind me, their voices carrying notes of confusion and unease. They thought they had won so easily, but they had no idea that the real game was just beginning. Back in my bedroom, I pulled out my old address book and began making mental notes about which calls to make first. After 30 years of careful planning and patient work, it was finally time to reveal exactly who Clarice Morrison really was. 6 months earlier, I had been arranging flowers in the front hallway when I heard Thalia's voice drifting from the kitchen. She was on the phone with someone, her tone different from the sweet, respectful voice she used around Quinn and me. "The old bat doesn't suspect a thing," she had said with a laugh that made my blood run cold. "Quinn's so easy to manipulate when he thinks with his other head. Another few months and everything will be ours." I had frozen with a white rose halfway to the vase, my heart pounding so loudly I was afraid she might hear it. Quietly, I had moved closer to the kitchen doorway, staying hidden behind the wall. "No, she's completely clueless," Thalia continued. "Just sits around all day arranging flowers and planning dinner parties. Never worked a day in her life. Never even balanced a checkbook. When Quinn divorces her, she won't know what hit her." The woman on the other end must have asked a question because Thalia paused before answering with another cruel laugh. "Of course he's going to divorce her. I've been working on him for months, pointing out how boring she is, how she never contributed anything meaningful to his success. He's already talking to lawyers. The prenup she signed 30 years ago is ironclad. She gets nothing." That night, I had lain awake beside Quinn, listening to his peaceful breathing while my mind raced. For the first time in our marriage, I was grateful he was such a sound sleeper. I needed time to think, to process what I had learned, and most importantly, to plan. The next morning, while Quinn was at his office and Thalia was at her yoga class, I had gone into his study and carefully photographed every document I could find: bank statements, investment portfolios, property deeds, business contracts. Everything that Quinn believed proved his financial success and ownership of our life together. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions. Not only was Quinn planning to divorce me, but he and Thalia had already started discussing how to liquidate assets quickly. There were notes in Quinn's handwriting about selling the house, cashing out investments, and moving money offshore. They weren't just planning to leave me with nothing. They were planning to disappear with everything. That afternoon, I had driven to a part of town I rarely visited and walked into a small office building that housed several businesses. The bronze nameplate on the door read, "Sterling Financial Consultants," but the woman who greeted me knew me by a different name entirely. "Good afternoon, Ms. Sterling," she had said with a warm smile. "It's been a while since you've visited the office in person." For 30 years, I had been living a double life that even I sometimes forgot about. When I married Quinn, I had been young and naive enough to believe that love was enough. I had signed his prenup without reading it carefully, eager to prove that I wasn't marrying him for money. What Quinn didn't know was that I didn't need his money. I had plenty of my own. My maiden name was Clarice Sterling, and the Sterling family had been quietly building wealth for generations. When I turned 21, I had inherited a substantial trust fund that I had never touched. Instead, I had used my business degree, the one Quinn never bothered to ask about, to invest and grow that money into something much larger. Sterling Financial Consultants wasn't just a company I owned. It was an empire I had built from my grandmother's inheritance, carefully hidden behind layers of legal structures that protected both my identity and my assets. For 3 decades, while playing the role of devoted housewife, I had been running a multi-million-dollar investment firm specializing in helping other women protect and grow their wealth. The irony wasn't lost on me that some of my biggest clients were women going through divorces, women whose husbands had underestimated them just as Quinn had underestimated me. "I need to accelerate our timeline," I had told my assistant that day. "Prepare the Morrison portfolio transfers immediately." She had nodded without question. After all, she had been helping me manage the financial aspects of my marriage for years, ensuring that every major purchase Quinn thought he was making with his money was actually being funded through my carefully structured loans and investments. The house Quinn was so confident about keeping? Purchased with a loan from one of my holding companies. The luxury cars he drove? Leased through another Sterling entity. His business that he was so proud of? Kept afloat for the past decade through strategic investments from anonymous partners who were all connected to me. Over the following months, I had watched Quinn and Thalia's relationship develop with a mixture of disgust and fascination. They thought they were being so clever, so discreet. Quinn would take longer business trips that coincided with Thalia's spa weekends. They would exchange meaningful glances across the dinner table when they thought I wasn't looking. Thalia began wearing my jewelry to events, claiming Quinn had suggested it. The most painful part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was watching the man I had loved for 30 years transform into someone I barely recognized. He became crueler in small ways, criticizing my appearance, dismissing my opinions, treating me like an inconvenience in my own home. I realized that Thalia hadn't corrupted him. She had simply revealed who he really was underneath the charm he had used to win me over 3 decades ago. 2 weeks before that terrible morning in the kitchen, I had overheard them planning the details of their new life together. They had picked out a house in California, planned a honeymoon in Europe, and even discussed having children. They spoke about their future with the casual confidence of people who believed they had already won. "Once the divorce is final and we liquidate everything, we'll have enough to live comfortably for years," Quinn had said. "Clarice will probably move in with her sister in Ohio. She doesn't have anywhere else to go." Thalia had laughed at that. A sound like breaking glass. "Poor thing. 30 years of marriage and nothing to show for it. Maybe she'll finally have to get a job." If only they knew that while they were planning their theft of my life, I was quietly dismantling the financial foundation that made their dreams possible. Every account Quinn thought he controlled, every investment he believed was his, every asset he planned to steal. All of it was connected to me through a web of legal structures he didn't even know existed. Now, as I sat in my bedroom making those phone calls, I felt a sense of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. Tomorrow morning, Quinn and Thalia would discover exactly what happened when you tried to steal from someone who had been 10 steps ahead of you all along. The first call I made was to my attorney. The second was to my accountant. The third was to the management company that handled my real estate holdings. By the time I finished, everything was in motion. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would change all our lives forever. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Quinn's voice echoing through the house. But it wasn't the confident tone I had grown accustomed to over the years. There was panic in it, raw and desperate. I could hear him on the phone in his study, his words carrying down the hallway to where I sat calmly finishing my morning coffee. "What do you mean the account is frozen?" he was saying, his voice rising with each word. "That's impossible. I'm the primary account holder. I've banked there for 25 years. I took another sip of my coffee, savoring both the rich flavor and the satisfaction of hearing my plan begin to unfold. At exactly 9 o'clock the previous evening, My attorneys had filed the necessary paperwork to freeze all joint accounts pending investigation of fraudulent transfers. It was perfectly legal and completely devastating. The sound of heavy footsteps announced Quinn's approach before he burst into the kitchen, his face flushed red with anger and confusion. He was still in his pajamas, his graying hair disheveled, clutching his phone like a lifeline. "Clarice, something's wrong with the bank," he said, his eyes wild. "They're saying our accounts are frozen. There must be some mistake." I set down my cup carefully, meeting his gaze with the same calm expression I had worn yesterday. "There's no mistake, Quinn." He stared at me for a long moment, his mouth opening and closing as he processed my words. "What are you talking about? What did you do?" "I protected my assets," I said simply. "Assets that you were planning to steal from me." The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. Behind him, Thalia appeared in the doorway wearing my nightgown this time, her expression shifting from sleepy confusion to sharp alertness. "What's she talking about?" Thalia demanded, moving to stand beside Quinn. "What assets? She doesn't have any assets." I almost laughed at the certainty in her voice. For months I had watched this woman systematically destroy my marriage while believing she was so much smarter than the naive housewife she was manipulating. The truth was going to be particularly bitter for her to swallow. "Quinn," I said, standing and walking to the kitchen window that overlooked our perfectly manicured garden. "Tell me, do you remember how we bought this house?" He frowned, clearly confused by the change of subject. "Of course I remember. I worked overtime for 2 years to save for the down payment." "Actually, the down payment came from a loan," I corrected gently. "A loan from Sterling Financial Group. Do you remember signing those papers?" "Sterling Financial is just another bank," he said dismissively, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. I turned to face them both, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. "Sterling Financial isn't a bank, Quinn. It's my company. Has been for 30 years. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Quinn's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like fear. "That's impossible," Thalia said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're just a housewife. You don't know anything about business." "I have a master's degree in business administration from Northwestern," I said calmly. "Graduated summa cum laude in 1992, the year before I married Quinn, actually." Quinn sank into one of the kitchen chairs as if his legs could no longer support him. "You never told me that. You never asked." The words came out sharper than I intended, carrying 30 years of suppressed frustration. "In fact, Quinn, there are a lot of things you never bothered to ask about your wife." I walked to the kitchen island and picked up a folder I had placed there earlier that morning. With deliberate care, I opened it and began laying out documents on the marble surface. "This is the deed to the house," I said, placing the first paper down. "As you can see, it's owned by Sterling Holdings LLC, which is a subsidiary of Sterling Financial Group. You've been paying rent to my company for 28 years?" Quinn's hands trembled as he reached for the document, his eyes scanning the legal language that he had somehow never bothered to read carefully when he signed it decades ago. "The cars," I continued, placing down lease agreements, "also owned by Sterling entities. The boat, the country club membership, even your precious golf clubs, all purchased through my companies and leased back to you at extremely favorable rates." Thalia grabbed one of the papers, her perfectly manicured nails crumpling the edges as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. "This doesn't make any sense. Where would you get this kind of money?" "My family," I said simply. "The Sterling family has been in finance for 4 generations. When my grandmother died, she left me a trust fund worth approximately $8 million. Instead of spending it, I invested it. Today, Sterling Financial Group manages assets worth over $200 million. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. I watched as Quinn's face went completely white, his mouth moving silently as he tried to process what I had just told him. $200 million? He whispered. "Give or take a few million," I said with a shrug that I hoped looked casual. The market fluctuates, you understand? Thalia was staring at me as if I had suddenly sprouted wings. The woman who had spent months mocking me as a useless housewife was realizing that she had been trying to steal from someone who could buy and sell her family's entire bloodline without noticing the expense. "But why?" Quinn asked, his voice broken. "Why did you hide this from me? Why did you let me think I was providing for us?" For the first time since this conversation began, I felt a pang of something that might have been sadness. Because I loved you, Quinn. I wanted you to feel important, successful, like the provider you needed to be. I thought that was what a good wife did. "And now?" Thalia asked, though she seemed afraid to hear the answer. I looked at her directly. This woman who had invaded my home, stolen my husband, and planned to destroy my life. Now I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not. Quinn was reading through the documents with growing horror, finally understanding the true scope of what he had been planning to steal. Every asset he thought belonged to him. Every investment he believed would fund his new life with Thalia. Every bit of financial security he had counted on. All of it was mine, legally and completely. "The divorce papers you had drawn up," I said conversationally. "They're worthless, by the way. You can't divorce someone and take assets that were never yours to begin with." Thalia's face had gone from pale to a sickly green color. "But the prenup protects my assets from you," I explained patiently. "It was designed to ensure that if our marriage failed, you couldn't claim any part of my family's wealth. Ironically, it was the smartest thing you ever convinced Quinn to insist on." The kitchen fell silent again, except for the sound of papers rustling as Quinn continued to flip through document after document, each one revealing another layer of his financial dependence on the woman he had planned to discard. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that held a mixture of awe and terror. "What happens now?" I smiled then, the same calm smile that had unnerved them both yesterday. "Now, Quinn, you learn what it feels like to have nothing." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls, legal documents, and the slow, methodical destruction of every assumption Quinn and Thalia had built their future on. I watched from my position at the kitchen counter as Quinn tried desperately to contact his lawyer, his banker, even his business partners, only to discover that the financial foundation of his entire adult life had been an elaborate illusion. "My business accounts," he said after hanging up from his fourth phone call, his voice hollow with disbelief. "They're saying my business has no liquid assets. How is that possible?" I poured myself another cup of coffee, taking my time with the cream and sugar while he waited for an answer. "Your business has been operating at a loss for the past 8 years, Quinn. The only reason it stayed afloat was because of strategic investments from Sterling Capital Partners." "Sterling Capital Partners," he repeated slowly. "Another one of your companies?" "My flagship investment firm," I confirmed. "We specialize in keeping struggling businesses alive when they have sentimental value to our primary stakeholders." Thalia had been unusually quiet during this revelation, but now she spoke up, her voice shaky. "You've been lying to us for years. This is fraud." I turned to look at her, this woman who had been wearing my clothes and planning to steal my life, and I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. "Fraud would be if I had taken something that didn't belong to me, Thalia, like you've been doing for the past year." She flinched as if I had struck her, but I wasn't finished. "Fraud would be seducing a married man and convincing him to divorce his wife so you could steal what you thought was his money. Fraud would be moving into someone else's home and wearing their clothes while plotting to destroy their life." Quinn stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. "That's enough, Clarice. You've made your point. Have I?" I asked mildly. "Because I'm not sure you understand the full scope of what you attempted to do to me." I walked to the kitchen junk drawer and pulled out a manila folder that had been sitting there for weeks, hidden in plain sight among the takeout menus and warranty information that accumulates in every household. "For the past 6 months," I said, opening the folder and spreading its contents across the counter, "I've been documenting your affair. Text messages, hotel receipts, credit card statements showing expensive dinners for 2 while I was supposedly visiting my sister. Did you really think I wouldn't notice when you started charging romantic getaways to our joint credit card?" Quinn's face went ashen as he recognized his own handwriting on several of the documents. Love notes he had written to Thalia, printed emails discussing their plans, even photos they had taken together that he thought were private. "You went through my personal things," he accused, but his voice lacked conviction. "I went through our joint financial records," I corrected. "Everything you used to fund your affair came from accounts that I had access to as your wife. Accounts that, as it turns out, were funded entirely by my companies." Thalia grabbed one of the photos, her face crumpling as she saw herself wrapped in Quinn's arms at a resort in Florida. "You can't use these in court. It's an invasion of privacy." "I don't need to use them in court," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "The beauty of actually owning everything is that I don't need to prove adultery to protect my assets. I just need to revoke your access to them." I pulled out my phone and made a call that they could both hear. "Margaret? Yes, it's Clarice. Please execute the Morrison termination protocols immediately. All accounts, all properties, all business relationships. Yes, everything we discussed." Quinn grabbed my arm as I hung up, his fingers digging into my wrist with desperate strength. "What termination protocols? What did you just do?" I looked down at his hand on my arm, and something in my expression made him release me immediately. "I just severed every financial connection between the Sterling companies and Quinn Morrison. Your business loans have been called in immediately, your credit lines have been frozen, and the lease agreements on this house, the cars, and everything else have been terminated." "You can't do that," Thalia whispered, but she was staring at me with growing understanding of exactly how much power I actually wielded. "I can do anything I want with my own money and my own property," I said calmly. "And as of this moment, Quinn Morrison is no longer a client of Sterling Financial Group." The house phone rang, interrupting the stunned silence that followed my words. I answered it with a cheerful voice that seemed to further unnerve my audience. "Morrison Residence, this is Clarice." "Oh, hello, David. Yes, I've been expecting your call." "No, that's perfectly fine. I understand completely. Yes, I'll make sure he gets the message." I hung up and turned back to Quinn and Thalia, who were watching me with expressions of growing dread. "That was your business partner, David Chen," I told Quinn conversationally. "It seems Sterling Capital Partners was the silent partner in your consulting firm. With our investment withdrawn, the company is now technically bankrupt. David wanted me to let you know that your partnership is dissolved effective immediately." Quinn sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. 30 years, he muttered. 30 years I thought I was building something. "You were building something," I said, feeling an unexpected stab of genuine sadness for the man I had once loved. "You just weren't building it with your own money." "How long have you known?" he asked without looking up. "About us, I mean." "About your affair? 6 months? About the plan to divorce me and steal everything? 3 months? About Thalia researching the value of our assets and planning your escape to California? 2 weeks." Thalia's mouth fell open. "How could you possibly know about California?" I pulled out my tablet and showed them a screen that displayed what looked like a private social media account. "Thalia Morrison to be," I read aloud. "That's the Instagram account you created to document your new life, isn't it? Very detailed planning, by the way. I particularly enjoyed the photos of the house you picked out in Malibu." She grabbed the tablet from my hands, scrolling through her own posts with growing horror. "This account is private. You couldn't have accessed it without significant resources and the right connections," I finished for her. "You're absolutely right. The kind of resources that come with running a financial empire." Quinn finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and defeated. "What do you want from us, Clarice? Do you want me to beg? To grovel? Tell me what you want." I considered his question carefully, surprised to find that I felt more pity than anger looking at this broken man who had once been my husband. "I want you to understand something, Quinn," I said finally. "For 30 years, I gave you everything. My youth, my devotion, my financial support, my complete trust. I turned myself into the woman I thought you needed me to be, and I did it gladly because I believed we were building a life together." I paused, looking around the kitchen that had been the heart of our home for so many years. "But you didn't want a partner. You wanted an audience." Someone to admire your success without ever questioning where it came from. Well, now you know where it came from. It came from me. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of car doors slamming outside. Through the window, I could see a team of movers beginning to unload equipment from a large truck. "Who are they?" Thalia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at my watch. "Right on time. Those are the movers I hired to help you pack your belongings. You have 2 hours to gather everything that actually belongs to you and leave my house." Quinn's head snapped up. 2 hours? Clarice, be reasonable. We need time to figure out what to do next. You had months to figure out what to do next, I replied coolly. You just made the wrong choice. Watching Quinn and Thalia pack their belongings was perhaps the most surreal experience of my entire life. For two people who had been so confident about taking everything I owned just 24 hours earlier, they moved through the house like ghosts, touching objects with trembling hands as if they couldn't quite believe they were losing it all. Quinn stood in his study for nearly an hour, staring at the mahogany desk that had belonged to his father. I found him there, running his fingers along the carved edges with an expression of profound loss. "This was my father's," he said without looking at me. "It's been in my family for 3 generations. And now it stays in this house, which belongs to me," I replied, though I kept my voice gentle. Despite everything, I wasn't cruel enough to enjoy his pain completely. "You should have thought about family heirlooms before you decided to abandon your family." He turned to face me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. The Quinn I had fallen in love with 3 decades ago, before success and ego had hardened him into someone I barely recognized. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. "The affair, I mean. It just happened." "Affairs don't just happen, Quinn," I said, settling into the leather chair across from what had been his desk. "They're a series of choices. You chose to pursue her, you chose to lie to me, you chose to plan a future that involved destroying mine." He winced at my words, but didn't deny them. "She made me feel young again, important, like I was still the successful man I used to be." "You never stopped being successful," I pointed out. "Your business has been profitable for years. Your clients respect you. You have a beautiful home, a loving wife." I caught myself. "Had a loving wife, but it wasn't real," he said, slumping into his chair. "None of it was real. Everything I thought I had built, everything I was proud of, it was all your money." I studied his face, seeing genuine anguish there. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "It was real, Quinn. Your clients didn't hire you because of my money. They hired you because you're good at what you do. Your friends didn't respect you because of my wealth. They respected you because of who you are. Or who you were anyway. Then why?" he asked desperately. "Why did you hide it from me? Why did you let me think I was the provider?" I was quiet for a long time, considering how to answer that question honestly. "Because I loved you enough to let you be the man you needed to be. Because I thought your happiness was more important than my recognition. Because I was young and stupid and believed that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger." From downstairs, I could hear Thalia arguing with the movers about a piece of jewelry that she claimed was hers. Her voice was shrill with desperation, so different from the confident, manipulative tone she had used when she thought she was winning. "What happens to her?" Quinn asked, nodding toward the sound of Thalia's voice. "That's not my concern," I said coolly. "Though I suspect she's about to discover what it's like to be with a man who actually has nothing to offer." As if summoned by our conversation, Thalia appeared in the doorway. She had been crying, her perfectly applied makeup streaked down her cheeks. In her hands, she clutched a small suitcase that seemed pitifully inadequate for someone who had been planning to start a new life. "The movers won't let me take anything," she said, looking between Quinn and me with wild eyes. "They say everything in this house belongs to you, even my clothes." "The clothes you bought with credit cards linked to my accounts," I confirmed. "Yes, technically they do belong to me. But I need clothes. I need my things. How am I supposed to start over with nothing?" I stood up slowly, looking at this woman who had spent months systematically destroying my marriage. The same way millions of women start over after their lives are destroyed by people they trusted. You figure it out. Thalia's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked very young and very scared. Please, Clarice, I know I made mistakes, but I can't leave with nothing. I don't have anywhere to go. You should have thought about that before you decided to come after everything I had, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Did you really think there would be no consequences? Quinn cleared his throat. Clarice, maybe you could let her take some basic necessities, a few changes of clothes, some personal items. I turned to look at my soon-to-be ex-husband, this man who was still trying to protect his mistress even as his own world crumbled around him. Are you seriously asking me to show mercy to the woman who destroyed our marriage? I'm asking you to be the better person, he said quietly. I am being the better person, I replied. The better person doesn't enable thieves and manipulators. The better person protects herself and sets appropriate boundaries. Thalia tried a different approach, dropping to her knees in front of me with her hands clasped together like she was praying. Please, I'm begging you. I know I was wrong. I know I hurt you. But I'm only 28 years old. I made stupid mistakes because I thought I loved him. You thought you loved his money, I corrected. Money that was never his to begin with. I didn't know that, she protested. I really didn't know about your companies or your wealth. I thought Quinn was rich because of his business. And that made it acceptable to you to destroy a 30-year marriage? She had no answer for that, which was answer enough. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced down to see an update from my assistant. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced, I have some interesting news. Thalia, it seems your apartment lease was never transferred into your name after you moved in here 6 months ago. Since the rent was being paid from Quinn's account, and Quinn's account is now frozen, you're officially being evicted. The color drained from Thalia's face. That's not possible. Quinn said he took care of everything. I looked at Quinn, who was staring at his hands with the expression of a man who had just realized how thoroughly he had destroyed not just my life, but Thalia's as well. Quinn? Thalia's voice was rising toward hysteria. Tell her that's not true. Tell her you paid my rent. I thought I did, he said miserably. I thought I was paying for everything with my own money. Your own money that was never actually yours, I added helpfully. Thalia stood up slowly, backing toward the door as the full scope of her situation became clear. This is insane. You can't just destroy our lives like this. We'll fight you in court. With what money? I asked. With what lawyer? Thalia, you're about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between having money and having access to someone else's money. 20 minutes later, I watched from my front window as Quinn and Thalia loaded their meager belongings into Quinn's car. Except it wasn't Quinn's car anymore. It was being repossessed the next morning. They would have to find another way to wherever they were planning to go. Quinn looked back at the house one last time before getting into the driver's seat. Even from a distance, I could see the defeat in his posture, the weight of understanding exactly what he had lost. Thalia didn't look back. She stared straight ahead with the rigid posture of someone trying desperately to maintain their dignity in an impossible situation. As they drove away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, but a deep, profound sense of relief. The performance was over. After 30 years of pretending to be someone I wasn't, I could finally stop acting. But the real surprise came 3 hours later, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Clarice? It was Thalia's voice, small and broken. Could I talk to you, please? I almost hung up, but something in her tone made me hesitate. What do you want, Thalia? I wanted to apologize, she said, and she sounded like she was crying. And I wanted to ask you something. I'm listening. How did you do it? How did you stay married to someone for 30 years while building all of this without him knowing? It was the last question I had expected her to ask. Why do you want to know? Because, she said with a bitter laugh, I think I just learned what it's like to be completely dependent on someone else's money. And I never want to feel this powerless again. 6 months later, I stood on the terrace of my real home, watching the sun set over Lake Geneva. The house had been in my family for 3 generations, a sprawling estate that Quinn had never even known existed. While he had believed we were building our life together in the suburban mansion that had been nothing more than an elaborate stage set, I had been maintaining this sanctuary, this place where I could finally be myself. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was drinking wine from my own vineyard, wearing clothes I had bought with my own money, surrounded by furniture and art that belonged to me not because of a marriage contract, but because I had chosen and purchased every piece myself. For the first time in 30 years, everything in my environment was authentically mine. My phone buzzed with the daily report from my assistant. Sterling Financial Group had acquired 2 new major clients this month, both women going through difficult divorces who needed help protecting assets from husbands who had underestimated them. My client base had grown significantly since word spread about how I had handled my own situation. Apparently, there were many women who found inspiration in my story. Quinn's situation had unfolded exactly as I had expected. Without my financial backing, his consulting business had collapsed within 3 months. The man who had been so confident about his professional success discovered that most of his clients had been referred through connections I had cultivated, investments I had arranged, or recommendations from my network. His reputation survived, but his income did not. The last I had heard, he was working for a large corporate consulting firm, earning about 20% of what he had made running his own business. It was honest work, and he was apparently good at it, but it was a far cry from the lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. As for Thalia, her story had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. That phone call 6 months ago, when she had asked how I managed to build wealth while married, had led to a series of conversations that surprised us both. She had taken a job as a receptionist at a law firm and was slowly paying back the money she had spent on credit cards that I had ultimately been responsible for. More surprisingly, she had enrolled in business classes at the local community college. "I want to understand money," she had told me during one of our unlikely conversations. "Real money, not just access to someone else's money. I want to know how to build something that can't be taken away from me." I had found myself respecting her honesty, if not her previous choices. There was something to be said for a person who could learn from their mistakes, even mistakes as spectacular as hers had been. The settlement had been remarkably straightforward once all the assets were properly attributed to their actual owner. Quinn received exactly what the prenup had specified: $50,000 and his personal belongings. In exchange, he relinquished any claim to property, businesses, or investments that had never been his to begin with. My lawyer had been impressed by the elegance of the legal structures I had maintained throughout my marriage. "Most people try to hide assets during a divorce," he had said. "You just revealed who actually owned them all along." The house where Quinn and I had lived for 28 years had been sold to a lovely young couple who reminded me of who Quinn and I had been when we were first married. Full of hope, convinced that love was enough to build a life on. I wished them better luck than we had had. I kept some of the furniture, pieces that held genuine sentimental value, but most of it went with the house. I discovered that I had very little attachment to objects that had been part of my performance rather than my authentic life. The most difficult part of the entire process had been explaining the situation to my sister Margaret, who had known about my wealth all along, but had never understood why I kept it secret from my husband. "You gave him 30 years of your life," she had said during one of our long phone conversations. 30 years of pretending to be someone you weren't. Don't you feel angry about that?" I had considered her question carefully before answering. "I feel sad about it. Sad that I thought I needed to hide who I was to be loved. Sad that Quinn couldn't love the real me. But angry? No, not really. Anger would mean I still cared enough to want revenge. And I don't. And that was the truth. The elaborate revelation of my wealth, the systematic dismantling of Quinn's assumptions about our life together, none of it had been about hurting him. It had been about protecting myself and finally telling the truth after 3 decades of careful lies. The truth was that I was relieved to be alone. Relieved to stop performing the role of grateful dependent wife. Relieved to stop pretending that I needed someone else to take care of me when I had been taking care of myself. and him all along. I had started traveling, something I had always wanted to do but had never suggested because Quinn preferred familiar vacation spots. Last month, I had spent 3 weeks in Thailand, learning to cook authentic Thai cuisine from local chefs. Next month, I was planning a photography expedition to New Zealand. For the first time in my adult life, I could make decisions based solely on what I wanted to do. The business continued to thrive, but now I was taking a more public role in its management. I had discovered that I enjoyed the challenge of complex financial planning, the satisfaction of helping other women secure their independence, the intellectual stimulation of building something meaningful. I had also started writing, something I had abandoned when I got married, because Quinn had considered it an impractical hobby. My memoir about building wealth while maintaining a traditional marriage was nearly finished, and my agent believed it would find a significant audience among women who had similar stories of hidden strength. As the sun disappeared behind the lake, I reflected on how different my life looked now compared to 6 months ago. Then, I had been a woman performing a role, living in a house that wasn't really mine, married to a man who didn't really know me. Now I was simply myself. Successful, independent, authentic. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Margaret, calling for our weekly check-in. "How are you doing, sis?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine concern. "I'm good," I said, and realized that it was the truth. Really good. Any regrets? I considered the question as I watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. About the marriage ending? No. About the 30 years I spent pretending to be someone else? Maybe. But those years weren't wasted. They taught me exactly who I didn't want to be. And who do you want to be? I smiled, feeling a lightness in my chest that I had almost forgotten was possible. Myself. Finally, completely, unapologetically, myself. After we hung up, I remained on the terrace for another hour, simply enjoying the peace of being alone with my thoughts. Tomorrow, I had meetings with potential new clients, a conference call with my investment team, and dinner plans with a group of women entrepreneurs who had become my new social circle. It was a life I had built for myself, funded by money I had earned myself, filled with people who knew and appreciated who I really was. It was everything I had given up when I married Quinn, everything I had been too young and naive to realize I was sacrificing. For 30 years, I had believed that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Now I understood that real love, including love for yourself, meant refusing to diminish who you are for anyone else's comfort. As I finally went inside, I passed the mirror in my hallway and caught sight of my reflection. The woman looking back at me was 61 years old, gray-haired, and wore no makeup. She was also confident, successful, and completely free. For the first time in 3 decades, I recognized her completely. She was me, finally, authentically, powerfully me. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.